Okay, so we're here with Mike Miller, who was an incredible organizer his entire life, who worked as a SNCC field secretary, and we're going to ask him several questions. He's done several other interviews where he basically gave a rundown of the basics of his life. So I'm going to try to focus on some of the things that he hasn't been asked yet. So first of all, welcome, Mike. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. My pleasure. I appreciate the invitation.
Okay, so give us a little bit about your parents' background, where they came from.
So my father was born in 1890 in Russia, and for reasons I'll come to in a moment, my family was very secretive about family history. So I don't know a lot, but his father was some kind of a revolutionary in Russia. And when the 1905 revolution was defeated, there was a repression after that. And so my father was to the United States as a teenager to get away from repression against both Jews and radicals. I mean, he was the child of Jewish radical. My mother was born in the United States in Los Angeles. She met my dad. She was a good deal younger, 20 years younger than he. She was a librarian at UCLA. He was doing research there. They met, one thing led to another, and in 1937, they had me. So, and she's from German Jewish family.
And so did she have a college education to be a librarian?
Yes, she got I think she actually got a teaching credential at USC, but she never taught. So they met in 1936. My father, by that point, I think he was a furniture salesman. He was a left-winger, and my mom was a young person swept up in the passions of the 30s, and he completed that job. So they had she became pregnant. There was criticism in her family in Los Angeles of the marriage, and so they got away from LA. They moved to San Francisco, and that's where I was born, here in San Francisco. So I was born January 1937 in a left-wing family. My father, there's controversy about this. My father, according to some either FBI or CIA documents, was an agent of the Russians. Now, the reason it's a questionable document is Russian agents who were here wanted to look good with their superiors in the NKVD or whatever it was in Moscow. And so they would claim people being providing, secret information or whatever to them, whether they were or not. So whether that's true or not, I don't know. But he was very close, if not in the American Communist Party. He translated for the West Coast communist newspaper, The People's World. And those were the politics I grew up with.
How did you end up with the last name Miller?
Oh, at Ellis Island, they did this with a lot of people. His name was Milowski, and the immigration department person said, "Oh, people are going to have trouble with that name. Let's make you Miller."
Right. The common American story for immigrants of that period.
Right.
And so I know your father died when you were young, 13, is that correct?
Yeah, 19. So I'll tell you a couple of stories that illustrate the mystery of my father. He was doing labor education work, the Fishermen's Union, maybe a little bit with the Longshoremen's Union, but he was, for reasons I don't know, he became close to a guy named Jeff Khyber. Jeff Khyber was probably a member of the Communist Party and was a vice president of the CIO Fishermen's Union. Khyber knew an importer-exporter by the name of Gregory Gorby, I think because the union had a contract. And Gorby was looking for an import-export representative to open up trade with Russia after Soviet Union, then after World War II. Khyber connected my father with Gorby. My father said to Gorby he was very interested in the job. His only condition was that Gorby also pay for my mother and me to be on the trip. That was agreed to, and in fall of 1946, we took off. And we were on the HMS Gripsholm, a Swedish American liner. We landed at Göteborg and took a train to Oslo. In Oslo, my father met with communist members of the parliament. In Poland, then we went from in Oslo. He had a mild heart attack. We traveled on back to eastward through Poland. In Poland, he met with a guy who was the International Labor Organization delegate of the Polish government. Then we went to Prague. In Prague, he met with very high-level people in government, many of whom were communists. But we never made it to Moscow. The doctors in Prague said, "You will not survive a Moscow winter." Because of his heart, his heart. So we were camped in a very nice hotel in Prague for 6 months. Oh, no, well, 5 months, I think. And then we returned home in time for me to go back to school in the fall of 47. So how did my father have access to these high-level people? I have no idea. And I would ask my mother after my father died, resolutely not going to tell me. And I think in part it was the fear instilled in the McCarthy era, but I think there's something else that remains a great mystery to me.
Wow.
Now, when we were in Prague, we hosted at this hotel a party. I mean, there were top government people, the Slansky trials, that mean anything to you? Slansky was at this party.
Right.
He was executed by the communists. So it's a great mystery to me why he had that. My father translated for the founding meeting of the United Nations, which was in San Francisco. Here we are, we're living in a public housing project. I grew up in Sunnydale Housing Project. The guy who became the president of the People's Republic of China came visiting us, Tung Pi Wu. Now, why would this guy come out to our little housing project apartment to visit my father? I have absolutely no idea.
Wow, that's an amazing story. I had no idea about any of this. Did you ever try to track it down at any level?
I have, not systematically. I got as far as these documents. Ronald Radosh, I think is his name. Radosh, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the files opened, NKVD and whatever other files. And he did research in those files. And so he had a paragraph about my father in his book. And so because of that, I guess somehow that made it into the internet. And so a good friend of mine, Vic Garland, sadly just died. Vic said to me one day, "Mike, I'm going to pursue your father." The next day he calls me up. He says, "Mike, Google your father." So I Googled my father, and there was this file, this page.
Wow. So I'm sorry, go ahead.
So that's my background. And as I grew, I sadly never got to argue with my father about some of his politics. The basic value commitments I continued with my life, but there were things that just didn't make sense to me about communism, the Soviet Union, so on, and the Hungarian Revolution, the Polish newspaper, Poprusto, student rebels at the University of Warsaw, all these things. And when I got to Cal, there was a significant presence of people who called themselves third camp socialists. And they had a kind of plague on both your houses. The Soviet Empire, they called it, I think, and U.S. imperialism. So I learned a lot from those guys. Michael Harrington was among them. You know his name.
Yeah.
And we had a lively student movement at Berkeley. So I pretty much rejected the theoretical framework that my dad had and became a critic of the communist movement while recognizing the contribution many communists made to organizing the CIO and fighting racism and so on. When I met Saul Alinsky years later, and I said to Saul once, "Saul, why are you so hostile to the communists?" He said, "They don't think their shit's brown."
That's good. That's good and accurate.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That kind of summed it up. So anyway, that's a long answer to your question.
No, it's incredibly interesting. Did you take any other international trips with your family before college?
Oh, no, that was it. And when we came in 1950, my dad died. He was the Chinese Revolution had taken place, and now he was hoping to open trade with China. So for whatever reason, he had to first go to New York City. There were people in New York he had to meet with before going to China. And in New York, he had a fatal heart attack. And to give you an idea of the secretiveness of my family, my mom never told. I went to school the next day, and my mom never told anybody. So I started acting out. I was being a delinquent in my classes, and so I was getting U's in citizenship, even though I was getting A's in my coursework. And so one day I was called in by my homeroom teacher and said, Michael, if you get a final U in any course, we're going to have to take you out of your presidency of the Scholarship Society. And what would your father think of that? And I burst into tears.
Oh,
That was the first time I cried about it.
yeah.
And of course, she was quite upset. But it's a strange story. So that would have been a terrific trip to go to China. But
Can't imagine. Did that leave your mother financially struggling?
well, luckily we were at a housing project,
Right.
so we had very low rent. And she went to work first for the Bureau of Apprenticeship Standards, and then the State Department of Social Welfare. So there was she was kind of a clerk librarian, but she also worked for one of the referees. The state referee disputes between recipients and the county agencies. And there was a guy named Maury Rosen who was one of these referees. And he would have my mom come with him on when they'd go to trips. He'd go to various counties for meetings, and she was his transcriber. So she had a pretty decent job. And she and I lived in a public housing project apartment in the southeast corner of San Francisco. And then I went to Berkeley in 1954.
And what did you start studying there?
I had the idea I was going to be a lawyer at first. So I majored in political science. And then I think by my second year, I was getting more intrigued with sociology. And so I ended up with a double major, sociology and political science. And in my sophomore year, I ran for student government office. I got elected. One thing led to another. You've read about it probably, that we had this. It was really the first outbreak from McCarthyism on campuses around the country. And we had a campus political party called Slate, which included everybody from people just trying to figure out what their politics were and young Democrats to various strands of Marxists.
And had you been politically involved before that point, or?
No, I lived in a co-op for my first year. I became president of the co-op. The University YMCA at Berkeley was a little center of liberalism, and we did things against racial discrimination on campus. The housing office, the official university housing office, would list discriminatory housing. Negroes need not apply, would be in a university housing office. So we got them to stop doing that. And we got involved in some civil liberties, campus issues. That's when I decided you can't have free speech for the left, but not for the right. So I became a kind of ACLU civil libertarian. And then, so that my freshman and sophomore years, I was involved in stuff like that. There was a Quaker guy on the staff of the University YMCA by the name of Cecil Thomas. He got us involved in some anti-A-bomb testing stuff. We took a trip to Las Vegas and demonstrated at a testing site. So I was getting into all this kind of stuff in my freshman and sophomore years. Then a friend of mine, Hank DeSuvero, who was a student rep in the student government, his term was coming to an end, and he encouraged me to run to, in effect, take his. There were only a handful of liberals on the student government and it was mostly fraternity and sorority people. So anyway, I ran, I got elected, and so now I was a rep at large. And we started the graduate rep, first Ralph Schaefer, and then a guy named Fritjof Tygeson. The two of us introduced various resolutions having to do with student wages on the campus, racial discrimination, anti-apartheid, anti-compulsory ROTC, things like that, which never passed. But sometimes we get up to 5 or 6 votes instead of just the two of us. And he brought to the university the idea of a campus political party. So he and another guy, Rick White, were instrumental in starting a thing called Toward an Active Student Community. And I think I got elected chair of it. I don't remember. So the first election after they formed, they ran 2 candidates, and based on the their understanding of the Labor Party in England, had this unsigned letter of resignation, its candidates, so that quote unquote party discipline could be exercised in the same way the British Labour Party exercised discipline in relation to the parliamentary party. Well, in Britain, it made sense, didn't make sense to Americans. So the task campaign neither increased the size of the electorate nor elected a candidate. It was a bad defeat. So the next election, Task decided it wasn't going to run candidates. And I'm a rep at large now. So I'm getting increasingly frustrated by that. So I finally decided I'm going to resign and run. I'm going to put together a slate of candidates and we're going to all run together. So there were 5 of us, ranging from the left to kind of liberal Democrat, 2 women and 3 guys. We doubled the electorate.
Mm-hmm.
I got 45% of the vote. I was the highest vote getter.
Wow.
So we thought we're on to something. And that led us to form. Task went by the wayside. We reformed as Slate because everybody knew us as the Slate. We just said, well, we're going to call ourselves Slate. So we reformed as the Slate, and continued this idea of a campus political party.
What do you think it was about you, about your personality or your intelligence, that people kept turning to you for these leadership positions?
Well, I've never been a sectarian, for one thing. I mean, I worked with socialists, I worked with communists, I worked with liberals, I worked with moderates, and I had some respectful relations with conservatives too. So that was one thing. I think another is I just like people, so I was a gregarious sort. And I think over time, people came to respect my judgment about what was wise to do and what wasn't, things like that.
And where do you think you got that? Was it from reading widely? Was it world experience? Was it all of those things combined?
Well, I was cautious, which was one element of this. The McCarthy era was still in the back of my mind. And so caution was a fairly wise tactical stance in those days. So I think that led to people having confidence in me. They knew I wasn't going to do something crazy. And I don't know what else. I mean, the people at the YMCA, there was a guy, Pierre Delattre, a Presbyterian minister, Cecil Thomas, this Quaker guy. Bill Davis was the executive director, very cautious guy. So I learned a lot from the 3 of them. And then we had we had Trotskyists, we had Spartacists, we had communists, we had third camp socialists, we had utopian socialists. And then we had Kerry McWilliams Jr. Do you know his work at all?
No. Don't.
His father was editor of The Nation.
Right.
So you should look up Wilson C. McWilliams.
Okay.
He has a book on American. I mean, he brilliant guy, absolutely brilliant guy. So he was my TA for a couple of courses that I took, and we got to know each other. So he had an influence on me, and he knew the ins and outs of student government really well. He's maybe 5 years older. So he when I ran the first time, he took me around to places to do campaigning. And like one of the places he took me to was the bar where gay people hung out in those days. Well, that's a very secretive thing back then. So if Kerry McWilliams brings me to that bar, then with gay people, that means I'm okay. So anyway, I had a good time as an undergraduate at Berkeley.
Were you ever worried for your safety, or did you ever feel that people were spying on what you were doing or observing what you were doing?
No, in Mississippi, I was worried,
right?
But no, not at Berkeley.
So that's actually a good transition. You've explained a few times how you ended up in SNCC, but I actually just want to ask the racial justice kind of background, where that originally came from. Obviously, your dad and mom shaped that to some extent, but what was it in you that centered that and made that a real priority?
At the People's World newspaper, which I mentioned before, one of the reporters was a guy named Mason Roberson. Mason was an African-American guy. And when my father would translate these articles from Russian language newspapers, he'd have to go downtown. I mean, this is before the internet and stuff. He'd have to go down to the People's World office and hand in the translation. So I would go with him. And so I got to know this guy, Mason, probably starting when I was about 10 or 11. And Mason and I became friendly. And Mason came to our house for dinner. So we knew Negro people back in those days. It was Negro from when I was a little kid. Mm-hmm. And then my first summer job as a Teamster, I would work at work sites with Black guys, and I'd sometimes hang out with them for lunch. I mean, there was a black lunch over here, a white lunch over here. So I'd sometimes hang out with the Black guys for lunch. So I got to know, and it turned out one of them lived very close to me, so I would get rides from him to work and home at the end of the day. We became friendly. So it just was, I mean, it wasn't something I really thought a lot about in a sense, other than I never quite understood this prejudice. Mm-hmm. As I got older, I did. But so I'll give you an example. When we had in junior high, we had the Scholarship Society had a dance after school, and we had a young African-American woman in the Scholarship Society, and she was an attractive young woman, and nobody asked her to dance. So I asked her to dance. So my friends would kind of, they were that's a little weird, Mike. And I thought, what do you mean it's weird? This was wrong. That you segregated people this way and had prejudices like they smell different and bullshit like that.
Did you have any idea right before you joined SNCC and moved down to Mississippi, that you were literally putting your life on the line? Did you have any clue of how serious that move would be?
No, that happened because that's a little later.
Right, but just going down there, you kind of went in as California kid, not realizing the realities of what's going on in the Deep South and how violent it could be, or did you know that?
I knew. Well, see, I started out as the rep for SNCC in Northern California. Mm-hmm. So I think I was asked to do that by Chuck McDew, who was the chairman of SNCC. I think he asked me to do that in the summer of '62. Mm-hmm. And so for about 6 months, I was doing that. So this meant I was reading almost every day. There were reports. The national office in Atlanta had what was called a WATS line, wide area telephone service. So this was you could make long distance calls any place as part of a monthly charge. So it made long distance calling from the SNCC national office possible. So every day there was a report, and then it got typed up, and it was called the WATS report. Mm-hmm. And the wide area telephone service reported on various incidents going on in the South, a lot of them violent. So I'm reading these things, almost every day. And by December of that year, when Sam Block and Willie Peacock came out on a speaking tour from Greenwood, Mississippi, I said to them, look, you guys, I can't continue doing this out here without experiencing it directly myself. So they said, well, come to Greenwood. And I said, all right, how about, I don't know who said come this summer, but we agreed I was going to go that coming summer. So I drove to Atlanta, and then with people from Atlanta, we went to Greenwood. There was going to be a concert. It was called the First Delta Folk Jubilee. And Theo Bickel, Bob Dylan, Pete Seeger, and the SNCC Freedom Singers gave a concert on Laura McGee's farm. It's a triangular piece of property. One of these is a state highway. This is a county road. Parked along the state highway are state patrol cars. Along the county road are local police and county sheriff people. And there's, I don't know, maybe 80 or 100 of us at this concert, and a handful of us are white. So when Dick Fry was another white guy from the Bay Area, he and I were going to stay. And when Bob Moses heard that, he said, "What?" So when we have whites working in the Delta, it increases violence against Black. And so Bob was against our staying. So Bob, Jim Foreman, who was executive director of SNCC, Sam Block, who was the Greenwood project director, who had invited, they huddled and they made an agreement that, okay, we could stay, but we'd have to be close to the office. So we weren't there for when Dick and I were walking from the office to one block to the little neighborhood grocery store, and we got picked up by a cop, and we drove to the jail, and it's a little 2-story red brick jailhouse, like out of a movie about the South. And there are white guys looking through the bars upstairs. The cop looks up and yells, "You got me some nigger lovers here, boys." So we think we are going to get a bad beating in this jail. So we're there at the booking desk, and we hear the voices. The cop who picked us up goes into the chief's office. Chief Larry is his name. And we can't hear what they're saying, but we hear this buzz, buzz, and it goes on 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. We're getting more and more apprehensive. Finally, the cop comes out and he says, "You boys get back in the car." We thought, oh my God, they're going to dump us in the river. So he starts driving around. We're back in the Black section of Greenwood. He points to a new school, says, "You boys see that school? We built that." Now he's saying Negras. "We built that for our Negras." And he does the same with a recreation center. And then the next thing we know, we're dropped off back at the SNCC office. He said, "Now we want you boys out of town 48 hours. You're guilty of cohabitation of the races." And we walk into the office, and there's a big number of people there cheering, laughing, applauding. We said, "Wow, what's so funny?" Well, Sam Block called the chief. I'm sure this will be no surprise to you. There's this peculiar kind of personal relationships that exist in the South between Blacks and whites, even though there's this wall of segregation. Mm-hmm. So Sam called the chief, and he said, "Chief Larry, don't mess with those white boys. They know the governor of California." It's a total bluff. It is an absolute 100%, but it worked.
A bluff that saved your life.
Well, at least a bad beating.
At least, right. Right. But a little bit of fear and of who you know and your connections. And they didn't want that kind of press, I'm sure, getting out.
So I stayed this summer, and I came back here, and I wasn't back here for more than a week when Bob Moses called and said, "Can you come back? We'd like you to work on the Aaron Henry for governor campaign." So there was this mock election. Is that right? Or had he actually registered? I
think there was. I think Mike Sayer was saying there was a mock election before the election.
Yeah, it might have been the mock election.
Is that how you met Mike Sayer, through that experience?
I think I met Mike a little later, because I think he came onto the SNCC staff in '64.
When you came down to Atlanta, did they do any kind of training for you guys, or were you just kind of thrown into it?
Mostly thrown into it.
Yeah. And you were living it was just an apartment or a boarding house?
You mean in Greenwood?
In Greenwood.
Well, at first we were living, it was called the Freedom House. This is a home that some Black property owner donated to SNCC as a place where the SNCC people could live. And then when the idea that we should stay even closer to the office came up, we lived in the second floor of the office. We had sleeping bags and a fold-out mattress, and we slept upstairs in the SNCC office, 708 Avenue N. I still remember the address. So then I came back, and then Bob asked me to come back, but I wasn't there. We went to Jean D'Alessi and a young woman. That's a funny story too.
Well, go ahead. We can make this multi-part. We can go as long as you're willing today for, under
Okay.
2 hours. And then we can, if we don't get to everything, which I don't think we will, we can schedule another one soon.
Oh, all right. Okay. So on my way home, I went to New York and Boston because I wanted to say hello to friends. So I'm in Cambridge, and I'm having lunch with Howard Zinn.
Wow. Yeah. Wow.
You know,
Did you
so
already know him, or?
yeah, through
Yeah.
Nick.
Mhm.
He was our first big advocate in the academic world, and he wrote the first book about SNCC, the New Abolitionists, I think it's called. So I'm talking with Howard, and I can tell this young woman over here, kind of at the next table, is listening to our conversation. So she finally says, "Excuse me, are you from the San Francisco Bay Area?" Because I guess I'd referred to it. I said, "Yeah." She said, "Are you going there?" And I said, "Yeah." She said, "You mind? Are you driving?" I said, "Yeah." Can I bump a lift? So I said, "Sure, why not?" So you be in New York in 2 days. I'll meet you we arranged someplace. So she drove across the country with me, and she knew nothing of any of this Southern stuff. I regaled her with stories driving across the country. So by the time we got to Berkeley, she was quite interested in all this. So I get this call from Bob, and I said, "Well, is there anything else I can bring?" And he said, "If you got someone out there with secretarial skills who you can bring down with you, do it." So I knew that she had secretarial skills. So I called her up. I said, "Remember her name?" Anyway, I invited her to come with me to Berkeley High, where I was going to speak that afternoon and show a SNCC film. So she came, she saw the film. And then after the film, I said, "What'd you think?" She said, "God, it's so wonderful what you all are doing." I said, "You want to come to Mississippi with me?" She went, "Well," she said, "I'm not doing anything here. I might as well." So we met a couple days later. She got back in my little Volkswagen, and off we went back to Mississippi. So anyway, a guy by the name of Jean D'Alessi, who was a radio, KSFO, was the local AM station that broadcast San Francisco Giants baseball games.
Mm-hmm.
So Gene was the radio engineer who dragged the microphone around so that a reporter could interview players on the field and blah, blah, blah. We wanted to make tape recordings of Aaron Henry because the FCC had ordered some equal time public service announcements. And so we went to Clarksdale, which is where Aaron Henry was. And I'll never forget, he had a guy at the back porch or the front porch. There were men sitting with rifles across their laps as we were doing these tapings. Gene is a professional, right? And so he's not satisfied with the first tape, the second tape, the third. And so it takes us hours to finally do these 30-second spots. And we leave, and we're being followed out of town by the cop cars. And then we got, I think it was really just an accident. We got in a bad auto accident on the road to home to Jackson. By now it's night, and we're taken to a hospital in Holmes County. What's the major town? Can't remember the major town in Holmes County. And they decide that they can't treat us either because they lack the facilities or because they don't want to mess around with the civil rights workers.
Mm-hmm.
So the black undertaker somehow gets called, and he puts us in his hearse and drives us to Jackson. And we end up at the University Hospital, and they cut me open and took out my spleen. And I had, let's see, this arm was badly broken. So anyway, I end up at the Jackson Hospital, and about 10 days later headed home.
But you said you really think that was just an accident and not malicious from what you know.
It's unclear, but I don't, because it was head on.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be pretty foolish to volunteer to do a head on to hurt somebody. Usually it's from behind. They pull alongside you and then push you off the road or something like that. But I don't know. So anyway, I came back and resumed my SNCC rep activity. So by now late 63.
Mhm.
And I moved from Berkeley to San Francisco. We opened an office in San Francisco, and we did very well. The main thing SNCC wanted from these northern support offices was money.
Right.
Lobbying to build support in the Justice Department and in Congress for the work in the South, quote unquote, education of local communities, and when asked for recruiting volunteers. So we did very well on all those counts in our office.
And can you explain for people why there was resistance to having, a bunch of white college-age kids coming in to the South and specifically into Mississippi from all throughout the country, and what kind of danger that posed for people that actually lived there?
Well, there are two reasons that the idea of a big summer project that would bring white Northerners to Mississippi was opposed by some of the Black people on the SNCC staff. One was they were fearful of increased violence. But the second, which was a more delicate thing and a political thing, was they were afraid of being pushed aside by white Northerners who had more skills and blah, blah than they, and who local Black people would defer to because there was still the mentality of white superiority that is internalized by people. So this is a very complicated thing in the movement. And in our interviewing, I mean, I remember we screened out some people who wanted to go because they were so paternalistic. So we told them, no, you can't go.
Right. A lot of white savior complex kind of attitudes.
Yeah, that's right. And in fact, in some places, in some offices, what these young Black people feared did happen. In other places, it didn't. So it was a very complicated psychological, sociological dynamic that was going on with local people, SNCC people, white Northern.
And specifically in regards to women, I know I've read a few documents from the Civil Rights Movement website where they really talk about how when white women come down, just their mere presence, especially around Black men, puts them at, they're liable to being lynched or killed in some horrible way just because of the presence.
There are two to the presence of white women question. That's one of them. Certainly it pushes every button of Southern prejudice and racism to have white women and Black women working so closely together. But there was another dynamic of some Black guys and some white women having this romantic notion of Black-white. And so there were sexual relationships going on between Black men and white women that had they been caught, that really would have led to lynching.
Well, and vice versa too, right? I mean, that was, if you bring all of these young people together in their teens and early 20s, and that's going to happen. And so how was that handled by the leadership?
It was a hands-off issue. I don't think anybody ever addressed it. And luckily, I don't think it ever, there were no violence incidents specifically by that, as far as I know. Some relationships that developed between Black and white people out of that summer became lifelong friendships. So it's a very, well, as you know, probably better than most people, there's a very complicated dynamic. And it was the northern Black staff more than the southern Black staff who did not want the whites. And there was a certain correctness in this observation that local Black people are going to defer to whites in ways they do not to the Black field secretaries. That was that did happen.
You were the first person that told me about Emmy Schrader and the report about poor white people in Mississippi and whether or not to try to organize them or bring them into the movement. And can you just give a little bit of background about that, how that came about, the topic, and what SNCC ultimately decided?
Well, some of the white in SNCC said, we have to organize poor whites. We have to break this stranglehold of race on low-income white people. Otherwise, we will never break the solid wall of white racism. So that led to the white, what was that called? The White Community Project, something like that. But it was ill-fated, because as soon as white people learned that these white young people, local white people, learned these young white people were from SNCC, that was the that was the end of it. Now, a very interesting story, and I think I sent you the material about this. A few years later, in Laurel, the International Woodworkers of America had a local at the Masonite plant.
Mhm.
Did I send you this stuff?
Yes, where they're infiltrating the Klan.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And Jack, by this time, SNCC had voted white people out of the organization. So Jack Minnis and Bob Zellner, both Southerners, Southern whites. I think Jack was from New Orleans and Zellner was from Alabama. And Zellner actually had Klan members in his family.
Right, his father, I believe.
Yeah, that sounds right. So they went to work for the Southern Conference Education Fund, and Carl Braden were the co-directors of that. So Jack and Bob went to Laurel. There was a strike, and blacks were being used as strike breakers. Mm-hmm. And Masonite very cleverly used race by, I think Masonite decided they were going to no longer have segregated drinking fountains and bathrooms. And of course, this pushed all the white workers' buttons, and the black workers welcomed it. So they were great wedge issues. So Zellner and Minnis met with the white leadership, and it turned out that one of the key white leaders, he might even have been president of the local, was a Klan guy. And Zellner and Minnis were absolutely clear about their background in SNCC, Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And they said, well, if you want to break this racial wall, you're going to have to sit down and meet on a basis of equality with black people. But they did. And so they had a committee of 6. There were 3 blacks, 3 whites, and they would alternate where they would meet. One meeting be in a white guy's home. Next meeting would be in a black guy's home. So when they met in this Klan member's home, they met down in his den, and he had Klan paraphernalia on the wall of his den. But out of that, there became a group of white working class people who decided that they'd been hoodwinked by racism. And even after the strike was lost, they remained supporters of MFDP.
And what do you think happened to them and their children? Do you think that
I don't know. I don't know. I never heard of them being forced out of town by this. In other towns, that did happen, where a white family would decide this is wrong, and then their kids would get isolated, they would get isolated, and they'd move north. Mm-hmm. But I never heard about that move happening in Laurel. I don't know the answer to that question.
So interesting.
If there was a critical mass of them, 20, 30, 40 people, they might have been able to provide enough mutual support and might have included among them people with enough respect in the local community there that they just kind of, I don't know, ignored it, or the white racist people just kind of ignored it, or I don't know. I don't know the answer. Good question. You should go to you should go to
I'm writing a book on Lillian Smith right now, and that was very similar to what she would do. Is she would have these interracial meetings at her house and invite a bunch of black women and a bunch of white women, and do this, in Clayton, Georgia, which is Appalachia, where this is not happening at all. There's very few black people anyway. But what ended up happening was kind of the country people just kind of ignored it and allowed it to happen. And there wasn't resulting violence. But if you could give us kind of the flip side to that, what were white, and particularly poor white and working class white people in Mississippi really facing most of the time if they did step out of line to try to build some kind of bridges, whether they were political or social, with Black people at that time.
I mean, I think as a general rule, you would be isolated. That's the minimum. And you might have bricks thrown through your window, and your kids would be isolated at school and so on. But there were little exceptions to this that I'd hear stories here and there. In Pearl, is it Pearl, Mississippi?
That was a big anti-Confederate area during the Civil War era, actually.
Yeah, so there was a guy in Pearl who published a little newsletter that was anti-racist. I can't remember his name, but I went down and met him. And I said, well, aren't you afraid? He says, I've been here all my life, and people just think I'm a little weird. So there are different experiences in different places. In Hattiesburg, there was a Jewish guy who owned a department store, and I went kind of underground into Hattiesburg because let's see what had happened. Hattiesburg is in what county? Do you remember?
No, is it Forest County? Yeah, it's Forest County because it's Forest General Hospital, named after Nathaniel Bedford Forrest. Yeah.
So Forest County had submitted in '64 a plan to the poverty program, a grant application, and SNCC people wanted to see that. So I was kind of undercover, pretending to be a graduate student at the university there at Hattiesburg, and I went and interviewed some people. And this guy who owned the department store, I don't remember his name, he was looking for ways to the wall, and he was apprehensive about. He was cautious. I won't say. He was cautious about how he did it, but he did do things. I think he hired Black people in positions that they weren't then being hired for. So there are these funny little exceptions that you find here and there. When Fannie Lou Hamer started in probably '66 or '7, she started a pig farm, and her idea was she would give two piglets, a male and a female, to people, poor people, white and Black, and the condition of the gift was when your piglets have
babies,
you have to give a pair to some other. And white people started coming to the pig farm, and Fannie Lou Hamer gave pigs to white people. So here was some kind of relationship. Well, and then up in the northern part of the state, there's a Pentecostal seminary. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Oh, yes.
Is it in northern Mississippi or southern Tennessee?
I'm not sure.
But anyway, we went in there. This is years later. I worked with a woman named Marilyn Stransky, who's a Southerner. I hope someday I can get the two of you to meet one another. But she came to a workshop I did on community organizing. And after fighting me for a day on what I was presenting, she will tell you this, she had a conversion experience. So she decided she wanted to bring this message of organizing that I was presenting to the Pentecostal, holiness, and evangelical strands of Christendom in the United States, because she's a deeply faithful evangelical in a conservative Baptist. That's a denomination you probably know. So it's the smallest of the Baptist denominations. So it's headquartered in Denver, which is where she lived. So she decided she wanted to bring the message of this stuff to these strands of Christendom, and wanted me to be her consultant. So I said, how are you going to explain me? So and a key guy in it was Robert Linthicum, he's dead now, a wonderful, wonderful Presbyterian evangelical theologian who became a convert to community organizing. I'll tell you a story in a minute. So anyway, we went to that seminary. And if you go into that seminary, on the wall, there's a big picture of a Black minister, because the Azusa movement, which you may be familiar with, which is the beginnings of Pentecostalism in the United States, one of its key leaders is a Black guy. And so there's a big painting of him. And as you enter this seminary, and there are Black students there, so it's mostly white. So there are these odd there's these little crevices of exception throughout Mississippi. I learned throughout Mississippi. Bob Linthicum, you got time for the
Yes,
story?
yeah, please.
I met Linthicum because I read something he wrote and I liked it and I wrote him. And he was in LA, I was in San Francisco. So we went back and forth. One thing led to another. We met. He asked me to come down and do a workshop on organizing that he would recruit for, and he would he would provide the theology for it, and I would do the organizing stuff. So I asked him, I said, how did you get into this? He said, well, I was at, it's a conservative evangelical school just outside Chicago. Name doesn't come to mind. It's well known.
Don't worry, I'll look it up. I don't know it off the top of my head.
So he's a student there, and he's leading a Bible study group of young Black people in a housing project. And as he describes her, he says, there's this beautiful young Black who's part of the class. And as summer is approaching, she comes to him one day in tears and says, Bob, she said, they're telling me I have to become one of their prostitutes. And how do I deal with this? And he says, well, you just have to resist. You have to just. So he takes off for the summer, comes back. Eva is her name. He comes back. Eva isn't in the group. So he asks others, what happened to Eva? Eva's become a prostitute. So he goes to her door, knocks on the door. She opens it and bursts in. Eva, how could you do this? Well, the gang threatened my family. They said if I didn't, they'd break my brother's legs. They broke my brother's leg. And then they said, when I still didn't do it, they said they would rape my mother. And that was just too much. So I became one of their prostitutes. So he says, well, Eva, why didn't you go to the police? And she says, oh, Bob, you honky. Don't you know who the gang is?
Yeah.
And so Bob then says, my theology did not have room for her story. And so I had to re-examine my whole theological framework to gain an understanding of systems. And he did. He has a very radical theology. It's when I did a workshop down there, and he was doing the theology stuff, and Marilyn Stransky, this woman I told you about. So we're sitting in the back, and I leaned over to Marilyn. I said, Marilyn, this is too radical. People are not going to accept this. And so boom, at a break, one of the guys' hands goes shooting up. And I said, see here, we're going to lose Russ. His name was Russ. So Russ starts saying, I never thought of things in this way. You've opened up a whole new. So with people who take the Bible seriously, if you demonstrate something is biblically the case for them, they will take it seriously. There's another guy, this is another time, another workshop. There's a guy there who's the number 2 guy in the Assemblies of God in Southern California. So this is their biggest region. Southern California is their biggest region in the country. And they're a 3 or 4 million member. I mean, they're bigger than several of the mainline Protestants. So we thought, God, this is a coup that we got this guy to come to the workshop. Marilyn recruited him. So every time there's a break, he disappears. Dave disappears at every break. And then he's back on time. Then at the end of the workshop, we take a lunch break and we say, for those of you who want to talk about how you can participate in this, after lunch, we're going to have an organizational meeting. And the rest of you, we thank you for coming. So Dave disappears immediately. I said, well, we've lost Dave. So the meeting starts. Almost the first person there is Dave. I don't know if it was Marilyn or I who said, Dave, when you disappeared all these times, what were you doing? He said, well, I went to my room and I took out my Bible and I wanted to make sure that Bob was not proof texting. You know what proof texting is?
I assume using the text is, yeah.
You have a preconceived idea and you're using the text.
Prove
You're
your point.
selectively drawing from the text to support your pre-concluded idea.
Mm-hmm.
So he said, I had to go and look in my Bible to make sure Bob wasn't proof texting. And he wasn't. So Dave was one of the first people to show up to become part of the group. Anyway, I've had an interesting life.
Yes, that's just put it mildly. So what were you reading throughout your college experience and these, the early to mid 60s with your work in the movement? Were there certain authors or writers that you really looked up to and admired?
Well, at Berkeley, yeah, C. Wright Mills was, I think, a big influence on all of us who were the early student movement people. C. Wright Mills was a big influence. Louis Koser was a visiting professor at Berkeley. He wrote a book, The Functions of Social Conflict, and he was a democratic socialist. He was connected to Dissent magazine. So his course and what he was assigning to read were of influence. There was a guy in the economics department, an economic historian, I think was a Marxist. I can't remember his name. So I took his course. He was an influence. Jacobus Tenbrook in the speech department was a kind of left New Dealer, I guess you would say, and blind. He was a fascinating man. So all these courses introduced me to readings that, all were part of influencing my thinking. Then Philip Selznick taught a course on the sociology of organizations. And it was in that course that I read Michel's Political Parties. You know that book, Robert Michel's Political Parties? So that was a big influence. And then William Kornhauser taught a course on social movements. And I think there was a Crane Brinton book that we read that was an influence. But I would say really more of an influence than what I was reading were this wonderful world of interaction between graduate and undergraduate students that was part of the early student movement. Bogdan Denich, Bob Kaufman. Well, Bob wasn't that much older, but Bogdan Denich, Bob Kaufman, Arthur Lippo, Jim Petrus, Fritjof Tygeson. I mean, these were all people steeped in radical, except for Carrie McWilliams was more a pluralist and a communitarian. But the others were all Marxists, and they were steeped in the literature of the left. And we had, these conversations that would go on and on about this, that, and the other. So it was Berkeley was a great education. My undergraduate and graduate years at Berkeley were great.
And what kind of things were you reading when you were in Mississippi? Did SNCC, they obviously had recommended reading lists for the freedom schools and things like that, or did you guys have any free time at all to do stuff?
I'm there the year before the freedom schools.
Right.
So there weren't freedom schools. No, we didn't have time to read.
Yeah.
When I was in Mississippi, I wasn't reading.
How many hours would you be working on a typical day?
Probably 12, I don't know, 12, 13, something like that.
And so I know that you've said before that Fannie Lou Hamer she had a little bit of a soft spot for you. So can you tell us a little bit about that relationship and how that started?
Well, I don't remember how I first met her, but I had hitchhiked one weekend. I hitchhiked from no, wait a sec. No, this isn't the hitchhiking trip. I had driven to Atlanta. So on my way back to Greenwood, I thought, and in Atlanta, I bought the Ebony magazine issue that celebrated the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. And it was a wonderful, Ebony was a very slick magazine to begin with, but a fatter issue that had photography, wonderful writing. So I didn't have much money in those days, but I said, I got to get this. So I think it was $5, which was like half my weekly stipend. So I bought this magazine. So I thought on my way back, I'm going to stop by Mrs. Hamer's. So I went through Ruleville and she was home. So I went in and I brought the magazine with me and we pored over that together. And then when I left, I said to myself, Mrs. Hamer should have this magazine, not I. So I said, Mrs. Hamer, I want you to have this magazine. Oh, Mac. That's how she said, Mike. Oh, Mac. She said, thank you. So she was so appreciative of that. And then when I went to the meeting where whites were voted out, and she came up to me in tears and she said, Mac, I just don't understand what they're doing. That's what she said. Extraordinary woman. Extraordinary woman. Talk about the power of faith. She was a living testimony and a capacity for love that exceeds anything. I'm just an extraordinary human being.
Did you stay in touch with her after the
Oh,
ejection of white members?
I think I called her maybe once or twice, but not really.
So the other, well, your biggest relationship really within SNCC was obviously with Bob Moses, right?
Well, there were several people, Jim Foreman, Bob Moses, Stokely Carmichael, who became Kwame Ture. The relationship, the most were with Black SNCC people were those three. And then Casey Hayden and Betty Garman, who were both white. Mike Sayer, who's white. I guess those are the main people. Myrtle Glasgow, who's Black. I recruited Myrtle. Myrtle was a social work student at Berkeley, and I can't remember how I first met her, but I kind of drew her into Nick's stuff in the Bay Area, and then I recruited her to go to Mississippi, and she became full-time SNCC person. Hardy Fry was in Sacramento. I recruited him, he's a Black guy. And he was already in Sacramento, Friends of SNCC. But I think I was one of the people involved in his going south. Wonderful guy. He died. All these people are dead. They're all dead. Fannie Lou Hamer, Stokely, Foreman. Myrtle and I dated.
While you were in Mississippi, or?
No.
This is, no, yeah.
We weren't that foolish.
Yeah.
No, here.
I know you mentioned the concert when you first went to Mississippi. And I just wanted to hear, I don't know that you've really spoken about this in other interviews, but kind of the power of music. And if you were really into music yourself and how that related to the movement.
Well, I love music. My parents love classical music, so I grew up with classical music. And they liked folk music, so I listen to folk music. And I love Paul Robeson and his singing, and Theodore Bickel. And Joan Baez. Anyway, so the Freedom Singers were initially just SNCC field secretaries who started singing together. And the magic of that, we would, in SNCC staff meetings, even before the organization was unraveling, there were intense, and they would sometimes be on the edge of splitting the organization. And so the Freedom Singers and others would get up and just start singing in the middle of that, start singing freedom songs. And everybody would stop, and we'd form in a circle. And in those days, you'd cross and you'd hold the hand of the person next to you, and kind of rock with the music. And these were moments of healing. It was like a group therapy session, only it was music, and it was really magical. So I love the Freedom Singers. We brought them out here several times on tour, and they were really good. And then what's her name? She became the director of the African American or Afro-American, I'm not sure what it's called, department or unit at the Smithsonian. And she was a Freedom Singer. And she and some of the women started there's a women's a cappella group, but this is post-SNCC. What is their name? I don't remember.
I'll look it up. No worries. And what did you follow Paul Robeson's activism too, as you were listening to him?
Well, I mean, in my household, we were aware of all of that, and the Peekskill concert where there were white people throwing bricks at the concert goers and so on. And my folks and I went to hear him. I guess it was probably around 1947 or 8. He was going to have a concert at the Veterans Auditorium, which is a city auditorium, and they canceled out on him because of the growing McCarthyism environment. This is before McCarthy, but so he sang at Third Baptist Church. Third Baptist is the oldest African-American congregation west of the Mississippi, and they're one of the high status Black churches in San Francisco. And the minister there, he was not intimidated by anybody. People who wanted to sponsor the concert asked him about using Third Baptist. He made it available. Reverend F.D. Haynes. So we went to that concert, and I had, in those days was still 78 RPM records. So I had a whole bunch of his 78 RPM records, and I memorized a lot of the songs. I used to be able to sing the whole Ballad for Americans, and I knew all the parts.
But so you were more Baez than Dylan.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I know you've told the story about how you met Saul Alinsky and basically ingratiated yourself to him by telling him the story that you got fired and because of being a quote little Alinsky. But I wondered if you could just give us a little bit about kind of he seems like he was probably a tough egg to crack, and that you had to kind of work to get into his good graces, and how did that early relationship go?
Well, no, I didn't have to work really. Let's see. So in SNCC, there was a lot of criticism of Alinsky, and I never quite understood what it was about. Anne Proston was in the Chicago Friends of SNCC, and her husband, Jesse Proston, was a key official in the Packing House Workers Union. Ralph Hellstein was the president of the Packing House Workers Union and was on Alinsky's board and a supporter, obviously, of Alinsky. So I was in Chicago for some occasion, and I said to Anne, I'm really trying to understand why there's this antagonism toward Alinsky on the part of people mostly in or around the Communist Party. And she said, you got to talk to Herb March. Herb March will explain it to you. So Herb March was a young communist working in the packing houses in Chicago when Alinsky organized the Back of the Yards neighborhood council. In the course of that, Alinsky and Herb March became close, became friends. His son, is it Richard March? His son wrote a nice book about his father, which you might want to look at. I called him. I was going to go to Southern California, and I called him up and I said, Ann Proston told me that you were the person to talk with to understand the relationship between the Communist Party and Saul Alinsky. And I'd like to come and see. Yeah. He said, come on down. So I was down there. I went to San Pedro where they lived, he and his wife, Jane. And we spent 4 hours together. They were just regaling me with stories of packing house workers organizing the early Back of the Yards neighborhood council, on and on and on. They initially had an argument about whether Alinsky could have done more anti-racist education and work in the development of the Back of the Yard. Herb thought he could, and Jane thought he couldn't. And so I watched them, kind of going back and forth for 10, 15 minutes. And she convinced him there was nothing that anybody could have done given the environment and circumstance. And so what I said to him, Herb, I said, after we'd been talking a while and had some relationship, and I said, Herb, I said, could you tell me what was the basis of your disagreements with Saul because of your Communist Party activity? Thought a minute, and he said, Saul and I never had any strategic differences in Back of the Yards. We had political differences. So I thought, I'm going to finally find out what the hell this is all about. And I said, well, what were those? He said, the Hitler-Stalin Pact. So I laughed, just like you are. I mean, you mean that was it? Yep. So Alinsky opposed the Hitler-Stalin Pact, and of course the Communist Party here supported it. It was so I've never fully understood it. I know that he was never a member of the Communist Party. He didn't have a whole lot of use for the Communist Party, as what I said or told you earlier. They don't think their shit's brown, but he was a master at identifying key people in contexts where he wanted to organize. And it didn't take him long to figure out Herb March was such a person, and that Herb March was a small d Democrat. He was a communist, but he was also a small d Democrat. And I discovered over the years that this tension between the party and some of their best organizers in the CIO led to breaks. I mean, there's a guy, William Sentner, was a Communist Party member who was a leader in the United Electrical Workers in St. Louis. And the party told him that he shouldn't have a socialist on his slate because the socialists are not friends of the Communist Party. And Sentner knew that this socialist guy was highly respected in the plant where he worked, and he wanted him on his slate. And so Sentner said, this is a quote in a a book about, I can't remember the title of the book, but anyway, Sentner said to the party officials, he said, you run your organization, I'll run mine. And so and this happened throughout the United Electrical Workers, really. And out here on the West Coast, Dick Linden, who was a warehouse, I mean, he had a similar kind of story to tell. It's throughout CIO history. If you really dig into it, you find these people who were communists, highly respected by their fellow workers, who, if something did not make sense to them in their union context, and the party was telling them to do it, tell them, no, we're not going to do that. It doesn't make sense here. And they had enough of a base that the party didn't want to expel them. Although March later was, he resigned before they expelled him, I think. They called him a white chauvinist because he wanted top two candidates for the district council of packing house workers to be a white and a black. And the party decided that they wanted a black guy to be the chair and a black woman to be the secretary treasurer, or maybe the offices are reversed. And Herb said, whatever shot at maintaining racial unity in this union we've got to have a black and a white in the top two positions in the district council. Party said no. So, and he quit. I think he quit over that. Anyway, there are lots of stories like that. Now, how did I got canned from a job at the Henry Street Settlement House in New York as a little Alinsky. So when I talked to Ann Proston, I wanted to know who this guy was. At our Slate conference, so we had summer conferences. So I think this is 60. I think this is 61. It could be 62. So the Slate Summer Conference is at some retreat center in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And a guy by the name of Hank Anderson is there. Hank is the research director of the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, which is the FLCIO effort to organize farm workers in California and precedes Cesar Chavez. So Hank's leaving the campground, and I say, Hank, where are you going? He said, I'm going to meet this guy, Saul Alinsky. He knows a lot about the Mexican California. So I said, you mind if I tag along? So he invited me to join him. And Alinsky had a home in just south of Carmel. And his wife, Jean, who had multiple sclerosis, lived there year round. Mm-hmm. And he would come west to see her. So we show up at the door of their place, and Alinsky had a very gruff manner. So Hank knocks on the door, Alinsky opens, Hank introduces himself, and Alinsky says, what's this guy doing here? Or something like that, gruff. And Hank is kind of stunned and speechless. So I said, well, Mr. Alinsky, I was fired little Alinsky, and I wanted to meet the big one. Well, this tickled, he had a pretty big ego. So this tickled him no end. So he regaled us with stories about his fights with the social work establishment. That's a whole separate long story. So I subsequently invited him to come to to be a speaker at a Slate forum. And he came up and he spoke on the campus. Then in somewhere around 62, maybe, he asked Carl Worthman and me. Carl was a grad student buddy of mine. He asked us to go to work for him in Woodlawn. By then, no, it must have been 63. By then I was involved in SNCC, and I didn't want to leave SNCC. But we stayed in touch because he was interested in recruiting me. So whenever, and then he had a 10-day workshop out in the Bay Area, which I went to, that was put on by the Presbyterians and the Episcopalians. And then he had a second one of those that I went to also. And at this second one, I think it was an Episcopal priest by the name of Barry Bloom. Saul, you keep complaining about not having enough organizers. Why don't you start a training institute so that you can train more organizers? And Alinsky paused for a minute, says, you raise $250,000 and we'll have a training institute in the Bay Area. And so the Presbyterian and the Episcopal diocese picked up that challenge. The key Presbyterians were Dave Knott and Bill Grace, and the key Episcopalian guy was Jim Guinan. And so the three of them and I were the co-conspirators trying to pull this thing off to raise this money. And I was still a SNCC field secretary, but because we were doing very well on all the things that SNCC wanted us to do, so I had kind of license to become involved in local stuff. So I became co-coordinator of the farm workers' first boycott, the Cesar Chavez-led boycott. I got involved in anti-urban renewal fights in San Francisco. And that's how I met these urban Christians. These are social justice committed urban Christians.
And are
So
you being paid for this work?
Well, I'm on the SNCC staff.
Right. But so not for the other, that's purely donating your time and
Yeah, well, it's a blur. Your time is not really your kind of your life is on the staff of SNCC, so it's not like you clock out. And we had a wonderful Friends of SNCC group in San Francisco. I mean, really high level, influential people in the Democratic Party, and the national treasurer of the Democratic Party. She was part of it. The Northern California chairman of Americans for Democratic Action. She was part of it. A woman who was a key person in the Jewish community here, Naomi Lauder, who later became my first board chair. She was part of it. Willie Brown, who became the chair of the state assembly in California, Black assemblyman, he was part of it. Phil Burton, the congressman. I mean, we had a terrific Friends of SNCC letterhead group that kind of was a umbrella of protection for whatever we did. I'll tell you an interesting story along those lines. Carl Blois was a Black guy. We'd become friends, and he became editor of this West Coast communist newspaper, the People's World. So he asked me to speak at their annual banquet. And, I was a little apprehensive about consequences for civic fundraising, et cetera. But we had a policy that anyone who wants to hear what we have to say, we're happy to speak to them. So I went to Naomi Lauder, who I mentioned, who's a very influential person in both the Jewish community and in liberal ADA liberal in Northern California. So Naomi says to me, well, let's go talk to Leo McCarthy and see what he thinks. So Leo is the Speaker of the Assembly in California. Leo listens to what I said, more or less what I just said to you. And Leo says, well, if that's your policy, then you should go speak. And he said, I appreciate your telling me in advance, because if anybody calls me up to ask why the hell are you on the letterhead of this Friends of SNCC group, this guy, Mike Miller, went and spoke to the People's World. Leo said, well, I'll just tell him, yeah, Mike talked to me first before he did that. And that's their policy. He should have. So I learned it was very important to him that he learned this from me, not from some hostile interlocutor who was raising hell with him and taking him by surprise. Telling someone like that in advance of something that might cause them controversy was a very important thing. And I learned the same thing in relation to the bishop in San Francisco, the Catholic bishop. This is later when I was community organizing in the Mission District. And we did something, we had a sit-in at the Wonder Bread Hostess Cupcakes plant here. I don't have this quite right. Well, I don't know if it was that incident, but somehow or other, we were going to do something controversial. Told the Catholic Social Justice Commission executive director, who's in the Archdiocese, we're going to do this, so be prepared to get some flack. And he briefed the bishop. And so it was the same thing. Being told ahead of time made all the difference in the world. It was a really important lesson.
I bet. And I mean, I just can't believe how many different movements and organizations you've been involved with throughout your life. It's really amazing. Did you ever meet Chavez or?
Oh, yeah. So I wanted to build a bridge between and the Farm Workers Union. It was in the National Farm Workers Association. So I wrote a working paper for a national SNCC staff meeting in which I presented the California Valley, the San Joaquin and Sacramento valleys, the equivalents in their relationship to California as the Mississippi South and Delta were to the country. And that the farm workers of California, largely Mexican-American, but significant Filipino element, that they were the blacks of California, the rural blacks of California. So I arranged a meeting, and I think Ivanhoe Donaldson, Terry Cannon, who was editor of our newspaper, The Movement, I think Stokely, and I went to Delano, and we thought we were going to meet with Chavez. We didn't. We met with Dolores Huerta, but that led to an agreement that Nick was going to place 2 people with the farm workers, and the farm workers were going to place 2 people with SNCC. I don't think the farm workers ever did their part of it. But anyway, Marshall Gans and who was the other from SNCC became farm worker staff. And when the boycott started, Chavez actually came to San Francisco to see me and asked me to be coordinator of the first boycott. So that was the Shenley liquor boycott, and we won it. I was co-coordinator of the Shenley liquor boycott.
It's amazing. And so they never sent anybody to SNCC.
I don't think so.
Was this a common tactic that SNCC used, though, or was this more you pushing that to kind of?
There were other places, but it usually depended on some local person. In the Chicago office, I think it was Ann Proston, who was the key person who made between Chicago area Friends of SNCC and local stuff. So because Chicago was a good office in terms of fundraising, etc., national office said, okay, it's okay to do this, but if it jeopardizes what we want you to do, then no more. In Seattle, it jeopardized. And so was it I or somebody else? No, it may have been McDo. McDo shut them down. Shut down the Seattle Friends of SNCC because they'd become like a local arm of I don't know, a Maoist left party or a Trotskyist left party or something. So if there was a local SNCC person in a northern office running that office, and it was doing what SNCC wanted for the South, it was okay to become involved in local stuff. I think in New York that happened also.
So we're almost at 2 hours now. I think this is a really good place to, it's crazy. I know it's so interesting. I could listen for a really long time.
Okay, Carrie Lee.
All right.
Always nice to be with you.